Left of the box. So, boy 15 fatally shot by two RCMP officers during confrontation south of Edmonton, police say. Teen from Sansom Cree Nation called 911 for help. A teenager in mental duress called the police for help and wound up being shot by the officers. See, this is why I tell all of my friends that if I'm ever having a complete and utter meltdown, do not call the police. They're trained to treat everyone as an aggressor and fire first, ask questions later. The news that a teenager was fatally shot by police early Friday morning has shocked many residents and communities across central Alberta. The 15-year-old boy from Sansom Cree Nation had called 911 for help, alleging people were trying to kill him. That would be the RCMP. RCMP said Friday. Officers found the boy in Wetaskiwin, Alberta, a city just north of the First Nations, with several weapons. Officers were able to confiscate them, but a confrontation occurred that led to Mounties firing their guns, according to news release RCMP issued Friday afternoon. The boy later died in hospital. It's sad, said Mary Mackinac Mind, who learned of the shooting from customers at work in Alberta, just south of the community. A 15-year-old, it's horrible. So just a little bit more about, so the RCMP received a report shortly before 12:30 a.m. Friday that an individual was following the boy who had called 911 and said they were trying to kill him. The release says almost an hour later, police found the caller in the south end of the city, about 70 kilometers south of Edmonton, at an intersection. Officers approached him and removed the weapons, but the RCMP did not specify what they were. So already in a lot of comments, I'm seeing people do the whole, he had weapons, so basically he deserved to die. You see it all the time, especially with like American news and the news of like a shooting of a black teenager or a black boy. And, oh, well, he had a weapon, or maybe it was a weapon, or this and that and the other thing. Well, from the sounds of it, they already had the weapons. They're not saying what those weapons were. And this was obviously a mental health call. You need to have people trained to deal with mental health issues. You know, you can't go in guns blazing every time there's a mental health issue and they have a potential weapon, because anything can be a potential weapon when you're in a mental health crisis. At some point, there was a conflict that led to two officers shooting the teenager. The release states officers performed first aid until the paramedics arrived and rushed the boy to the hospital, where he later died. So, if we go back here, they say the officers approached him and removed weapons, but they didn't say what it was. And then at some point, it led two officers to shooting this teenager. So, did they not take all the weapons? Was there a weapon that was so hidden that it was then he pulled it out and it was a threat to two armed RCMP officers? That something that could be concealed that well was such an immediate threat that both of the officers then decided to shoot? Alberta Serious Incident Response Team, which is supposed to be separate from the police, investigating this to see what's happening and stuff. But this is an all too common issue here in Canada, because, again, we're very distracted by what happens in the United States. And you hear about police shootings in the States all the time, and it's really high. And when you compare the United States to all the other, similarly situated countries, they're the highest by far when it comes to police shootings. But what they tend to forget to mention, or what our news media tends to forget to mention, is we're the second. We're the second worst. Of course, nowhere near as bad as the United States, but we are the second worst. And the vast majority of people shot by the police or killed by the police are Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples, often suffering a mental health crisis. Just a tragic story. And, defund, dismantle, reinvent. Officers of any sort should never be going to a mental health situation, because too many tragedies like this happen, and it is a tragedy. So this is Brandy Morin. She is a journalist, one who's had tangles with the police before because they don't like journalists who are, pointing out their brutality and all the things that they're doing. And she is also Indigenous. And she says the 15-year-old boy from Sansom Cree Nation who was shot and killed by RCMP Friday morning in Wetaskiwin, Alberta, was Haas Lightning. His maternal grandmother sent me this photo taken of him earlier this year. He's asking his grandmother if he looks like his late grandfather in the photo he's holding. He was loved and cherished by his family, who are devastated. And remember, there's so many comments right now. Whenever you see this article posted in the comments on Twitter about people just basically saying this kid deserved it. This kid who was having a mental health crisis deserved it because he had weapons on him, basically. But they tend to forget that he was a person. He had a family. He was loved. And they tend to strip away everyone's identity when it comes to these issues. And so the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team is investigating. RCMP told media Haas had weapons on him, although anything could be considered a weapon, and RCMP have not released the details. Kind of like I said, when it comes to mental health issues, anything can be a weapon. Anything. Haas had called 911 about an hour before he was killed because he was concerned for his safety and believed someone was following him. A kid, alone, walking around town. His life snuffed out like countless other Indigenous peoples who are the victims of the highest police violence in Canada. That is heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. So that was just taken earlier this year. It's just, how many more stories like this before there's any real consequences for the officers? Sure, the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team is investigating, but, police officers, generally speaking, and RCMP officers, don't face any consequences for this. It's part of the system. It's part of, the colonial settler system. The RCMP was literally designed to control and police Indigenous peoples, to literally go to their communities and kidnap children to take them into residential schools. Why do we still have them? Like, why is this still a thing? Why does this organization still exist? The Royal Canadian Mountie Police, because they are surprisingly not standing for racist. Just absolutely horrific. And this happens over and over again, especially with mental health issues. And what change has really happened over all that time? Nothing. They put together a serious incident response team as a way to look into it, but will there be any systemic change in the systems? No. These systems are beyond repairing because they're functioning exactly the way they were designed to function. It's not the bug, it's the feature. And so, you can't change those systems when they're working the way that they intended. You need to get rid of those systems completely. Defund, dismantle, reinvent. And then, just again, Terrell Tailfeathers is a very strong voice on Twitter, and he was pushing back because here again is one of those comments I was talking about. He obviously was a threat to the police. It's probably time to look inward at the statement of your own people because of your own mismanagement. Yeah, so that's racist bullshit right there. Because all Terrell was doing was saying, I want to send my condolences to the family of the youth and the whole First Nation because I know something like this affects the whole community. So because he sent that, he tweeted that out. This asshole tweeted out this horrendously racist statement. And then Terrell replying saying, imagine being this much of an asshole to leave this victim blaming crap under a message of condolence. Why not just leave instead of complaining about Indigenous peoples? And then the guy still couldn't shut up and said, I understand the truth can hurt. All you could do is complain about how the white man is to blame for your problems. If it wasn't for the white man, Canada would be a nation full of tribal wars. Instead, it's a first world country. And you wonder why advertisers are leaving the platform. Because racist asshole like this exist on it. And of course, catchy name here, Canada History XX. Well, he doesn't understand Canada history then, or anything of what happened here. Because, as Terrell points out, Canada still imposes the Indian Act in 2024. For almost 150 years now to keep First Nations peoples from progressing economically. Where would all Canada be without keeping that oppression in place to benefit from all those lands and resources? And so when I refer to Canada as an apartheid state, this is what I'm talking about, the Indian Act. It's because Canada is an apartheid state. Still. This is still an act that's in place. And so I have just a Wikipedia page, and there's also the Canadian Encyclopedia that goes into a detailed history of this. But the synopsis here, the Indian Act is a Canadian Act of Parliament that concerns registered Indians, their bands, and the system of Indian reserves, first passed in 1876 and still in force with amendments. It is the primary document that defines how the Government of Canada interacts with the 614 First Nation bands in Canada and their members. Throughout its long history, the Act has been a subject of controversy and has been interpreted in different ways by both Indigenous Canadians and non-Indigenous Canadians. The legislation has been amended many times, including over 5 major changes made in 2002. This is why I say Canada is an apartheid state, because it is. I get treated very differently than anyone who would fall under this act. You know, it says how reserves and bands can operate. Like even right there, telling Indigenous peoples how you're allowed to do your culture. Because for a long time in Canada, participating in anything that was their culture was illegal. Like they couldn't speak their language, they couldn't perform ceremonies, they couldn't dance, they couldn't wear their traditional outfits. Those were actually illegal at different times. The Act sets out rules for governing Indian reserves, defines how bands can be created, and defines the powers of band councils. Bands do not have to reserve land to operate under the Act. And again, there has been amendments and stuff, but the fact that it's still in place and it's still called the Indian Act is very, very bad. Attempts to repeal or replace numerous failed attempts have been made by Canadian parliamentarians to repeal or replace the Indian Act without success. Those changes that have been made have been piecemeal reforms rather than sweeping revisions. Yeah, so I will post a link to both this and the Canadian Encyclopedia article about this act, because this is part of what Canada is, and a lot of people don't realize this. Like, when you see the conditions on reserves, the way that the infrastructure is crumbling, lack of clean water, that is the federal government's doing. They are purposely underfunding these reserves. It's up to the federal government to make sure that the infrastructure is there and that their healthcare is taken care of and all that sort of stuff. And they fail time and time again. And a lot of these places are on land that is toxic. Like in Ontario in particular, you have the Grassy Narrows, which is contaminated with copper and has been for over 30 years. Like, you just go through a brief history of what this country has done to Indigenous peoples when it comes to the 60 scoops, the residential schools, the day schools, the dissimilar treatment, the lack of health care, the lack of clean drinking water, the way that they dismantle their communities, the way that, you know, they would say, if you get a job as a lawyer or this or this or this, then you give up your right to call yourself an Indigenous person and all this sort of stuff. Like, there were so many barriers put away. These families were shattered over and over and over again. And then some people are just saying, well, you're doing it to yourself. Some asshole white men, for the most part, just saying, you know, oh, well, maybe if you got your act together. And it's like, no, the government should be supporting Indigenous peoples however they want. There is no possible way to ever undo the harm that this country has caused. None. We have committed genocides. Canada has committed genocides. There are bands that were completely wiped out of history because of this country. There is no amount of money or compensation that can make up for the damage done. And so at a very bare minimum, this country just needs to shut up and listen to what Indigenous people say and say, okay, here's the check. That's it. That's it at this point. It is just disgusting that this is still happening, and, you know, very little media attention. You know, you don't hear about it the same way you hear about the shootings down in the States. And a large part is, again, Canadians tend to pay more attention to what's happening in the United States than we do pay attention to what's here. And if more Canadians paid attention to what's happening here, we could fix a lot of this. Like, we're in a parliamentary system. It's not that difficult to actually elect in a government that could fix a lot of these messes. But since people don't know where their power lies, they don't do anything because they think that change is impossible, because they're not taught that they can make that change. And, you know, back before I got into politics, one of the things that I was looking into was, where can I, you know, best make change? Is it through activism or through becoming like involved with politics? And the realization to me was, the best way to know how to change the system is to first know how that system works. And very few Canadians know how our system actually works. And so it's important that we share these stories, we talk about these stories, we get more people signing up to my channel. So that, you know, Canadian news can get out to Canadians, and we can, you know, start working to make a difference, because he deserved a life. He deserved a long life. It's no excuse for what the RCMP did to him.